Good evening and welcome to Screentone Club. We are recording on the 28th of November 2019 for release on the 29th of November 2019 because we're kind of already a bit late due to life and work and things. Who is late due to things? Myself, Elliot Page, and my lovely co-host Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yes, I'm doing well. I can confirm that late November moving into December is the time for things.
Yes, things like, for our American friends, eating turkey, and for me, buying digital manga in sales. Nothing. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Indeed.
So, this is our fortnightly manga podcast with a focus on drink discussion. If you like what we're doing here, you can support us on ye old Patreon. For just $1 a month or up, you can get a bonus episode, which we're going to be recording right after this one. You can also vote on what we cover in said bonus episode. We still have some quite interesting sort of items in the bucket, and you can directly influence what we have to read by chipping in a wee bit of money. And so, moving on, I suppose, to the most important part of the podcast is a shout-outs. Once again, thank you to Rob Jessup, who is keeping the podcast hosting lights on, which, as a quick side note, we've updated recently to the new version of our podcast hosting platform, which is now a lot shinier and is now HTTPS compliant. Hooray! Still some more work to be done on that, quite honestly. There's both more and less options available to us in the back end, which is kind of annoying, but whatever. That's not for you to know. So, first and foremost, we jump into the first part of our show, which looks almost like the lion's share of it somehow. So it's returning champions. So, Andy, do you want to take the baton? Because there's one thing here which is kind of a follow-up on something we talked recently. Dededede Demons, if you would.
Yeah, so I don't actually have a huge amount to say about this because basically my take on this is if you listen to our previous episode where Elliot talked about this volume, I agree with everything Elliot said. Because basically, yeah, I think you pretty much nailed everything about this volume and kind of what it does. Intrigued and both kind of a little mystified by kind of the turn towards the end of this volume. I'm kind of interested to see where they go with that. But yeah, generally speaking, I think you kind of pretty much nailed my feelings for it. So given that we have a lot of other stuff to discuss, I think I can kind of safely just say, yeah, refer back to the previous podcast for more details.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's going to sound weird, but I'm almost upset, or not upset, but I'm just sad that you haven't come along with some, correction to me to help lift the veil from my eyes. And, being told that I'm right is kind of weirdly not what I wanted to hear. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know. I was hoping I was going to be told I was myopic and that my uncertainty with that series and its direction, was, baseless. So, thanks? Question mark?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a weird one because I still enjoyed the volume. I'm still very interested to keep reading it and suspect I'll continue to enjoy it. But yeah, there's not really anything that kind of I feel like previous volumes have been so much easier to talk about in terms of oh, hey, look at this really interesting thing it does. Look at what they've done with this character. Whereas this is kind of, it's far harder to really pin anything down on it in terms of this feels very much like kind of an interstitial volume between what came before and what comes next, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it's all kind of fine and dandy, but there's not really anything particular that I can kind of hang my hat on as we've kind of had with previous volumes, and I don't have that kind of marked down as a concern. I was kind of, like I say, had kind of mixed feelings about sort of the end of this volume, but generally speaking it was just yeah, that was solid, that was fine, and now I'm curious to see where it goes next.
Fair enough. Okay, well, I'm still very much in to see what happens in the next volume, so who knows. Okay. So, on the sort of, Elliot has a bad feeling about this, bent, I'd like to talk about The Promised Neverland, which, some people on our Twitter feed, I mentioned that I was not having the best of time with it. And I've had quite a few people basically link me to previous episodes of this podcast where we gushed, at length about this series, which kind of just, for me, honestly cements the fact that I've been reading Promised Neverland and continuing to do so through the weekly Shonen Jump app. And I I just don't like where it's gone, quite frankly. Like, I know I made a bit of hay, both in our original podcast about it and then all returning champions ever since, where I was like, oh no, it's having a big shift. I'm not sure if I'm going to like it now. Or, oh, should I trust it? Oh, I should trust it. And now it's a case of, no, I think this series has kind of wet the bed almost and has like really, it's going to sound really harsh, but let me down in a way where I'm now basically reading it just because it's kind of clearly in the end game, and I just want to see how it ends up and like wave the authors goodbye as they head off to another series. Where it's gotten so into so many things that I just don't care about in the series and its world, like politicking, lots of stuff about the demons and their little world, which is both not very fleshed out by the corpus of the series, but also now extremely fleshed out by the fact that it is the single most important part of the series, is wrapping together all these loose ends and all these various unsatisfying like character states. There's like a really huge spoiler element which occurs, and as soon as that happened, basically the entire series kind of fell flat for me from there on. Like, it wasn't an immediate realization. It was a case of, I'm not sure about I like this direction where it's going. Oh no, it's really going in a direction I don't like. Oh no. And then now we are where we are, where I'm basically just reading the series out of a weird feeling of obligation, while still hoping that maybe it can tie everything up and then move on with its life. I don't know if you're keeping up with it, Andy, at all.
No, which I mean, in a way, kind of says something about my kind of feelings about it. I'm probably a fair way behind now, but like there was definitely a point where I kind of went from reading it religiously, like week on week, to being like, I mean, I guess part of my feeling was just that maybe this is going to work better in big, kind of more volume-like chunks. Like, I felt like it went from the point of being kind of week-on-week satisfying and having kind of good cliffhangers and things to keep me coming back, to feeling like more of a slow burn with a lot more kind of world building and stuff like that, like you allude to. And it wasn't like I kind of turned on it as like, I don't like this anymore, but it kind of stopped having that pull of kind of it coming around to Sunday and thinking, oh man, I wonder if there's a new chapter this week. And so it's, I will go back to it, and again, like, having heard a whole bunch of people saying like, oh, it's in the end game now, like I'm kind of part tempted just to wait until it finishes and then just kind of binge read what is left behind, because that almost felt from where I was at that might actually be the best way to consume it.
Yeah, I think at this point you'll be perfectly safe doing so. I mean, especially because beyond almost like the midpoint, it does start to become more sort of ongoing and arc based, and if anything, the chapter basis feels a bit unsatisfying. I mean, I caught up with it like a good 30 chapters recently to get to just basically sit down and try and, basically churn through in my head why I was not enjoying it. And looking back, there's a certain moment when there's a big revelatory moment, and ever since then the direction has been basically a dud for me. But yeah, it's I mean, yeah, as I say, I kind of just want to see how it ends now, so this is why I'm kind of just hanging in there. It's just, yeah, there's a lot of parts where I just find myself either shrugging or going, who cares, at the page, which is probably not the best way to consume a comic, let's face it.
Yeah.
So moving on, a quick shout out. This is a very quick quickie. Queen Bee, we talked about it previously. Queen Bee Volume 2, I read it. It's more of the same. That's kind of it. If you liked Queen Bee Volume 1, then Queen Bee Volume 2 is the same, with the characters you like and the comedy you like, if you liked it. Volume 3 is out and is in fact the final volume, which I'm almost sad about because I like the characters, but at the same time, like, there's only so much you can really do with that character set and the dilemmas they have. So maybe next round of sales, I'm going to pick up Volume 3 and give that a read. But yeah, Queen Bee continues. Lots of good faces, very important, good comedic faces. The characters are still sweeties, and that's kind of it. That's Queen Bee Volume 2. Cool. And moving on, this is another case of more of the same, but in a positive way, is Ranma Half. I caved and bought the next two omnibus editions of Ranma Half. Ranma Half being a series we covered in our bonus episodes. So if you want to go back to that, jump on ye old Patreon. But I bought the next two omnibuses, and so I had volumes 3, 4, 5, and 6 in 2 books. And yeah, it's still good fun. Like, it moves at a mile a minute. It's really funny. It's got a really good sense of physical comedy. It still has lots of fights and martial arts going on. The most recent arc had martial arts tea ceremony, which actually sold the concept really well. It introduced a new character called Shampoo, who rules, and then her granny, who rules even more, but if anything becomes a bit annoying. And it's going to sound really weird from me, but Shampoo was initially introduced as a character from China who couldn't speak much Japanese. And that was kind of half the fun, was the fact that basically most of her conversation was like short clipped phrases. And then now she's in later volumes. She now basically can speak Japanese, but just with a few missing sort of character, like a few missing words to bridge phrases, which is fine, whatever. She's still a very fun character. But it does kind of smack of, I had this character around for one arc, but people loved her, so I had to bring her back permanently, and now she's just constantly in the series, which I feel like is basically how Ranma Half ended up getting such a huge cast, is just that characters are brought in for a gag, but then are really beloved and so have to hang around, because otherwise fans will get upset. So, but yeah,
I mean that actually kind of sounds like the kind of the Rumiko Takahashi formula in a sense, because I mean, we were talking recently about Urasei Yatsura, which felt very similar in terms of like, character turns up for a little bit of the story, becomes popular, becomes permanent fixture. Like there's definitely a cadence, I feel like, with perhaps both of these works that is a case of you can kind of see kind of audience popularity actually kind of having a big part in formulating the series as it goes on.
Totally. I mean, you got to keep getting published in Shonen Jump to get the Shonen Jump money. In the case of Ranma Half, there are as many characters that end up hanging around. There are equally as many who reappear for a single gag every now and then, or just don't show up again, and you don't remember them because they're not that memorable. And so it's it's Manga Darwinism in action, where there are some characters who seemed interesting for their gag, but you never see again and you don't really miss because whatever. So that's kind of cool. It's really nice having, after the, unrelenting arseholishness of Urusei Yatsura, having Ranma Half being basically a bunch of idiot teens. It does the whole, it does a very early and pure version of Tsundere, where, the character gets upset at the other, another character, being doted on by someone, but doesn't know themselves. So, it's the old form of tsundere before it became just a personality defect that everyone has.
Yeah.
So yeah, really good fun, really, really good fun, quick read. Also, if you do what I do and get them in a 3 for 2 offer, they come in shockingly cheap, as volumes. So you get a decent chunk of manga. So yeah, that's Ranma Half. Really enjoyable. So Andy, you've got something else on here that I want to hear about because I've bought it but not read it yet.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, it's kind of partly your fault for tweeting or whatever about Volume 2 coming out. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember I was going to buy that as soon as it came out, so I should do that.
Well, if nothing else, I'm good for tweeting.
Yes, and that is Kaiju Girl Caramelise, which we covered Volume 1 of in a previous episode, and kind of, I feel like I was less positive on it than you, but it was one of those weird series where, kind of having talked about it and discussed it, and then with the passage of time after reading it, the further I got away from that series, the more I wanted more of it, which was kind of why I sort of rabidly consumed the second volume when it came out. And yeah, this is kind of an interesting one because in one sense, much like some of these other series, it's kind of more of the same. Like, it's more of kind of, this vital mix of kind of romance story and kaiju, as told through the lens of Kuroe, who is a girl who, when her emotions get out of control in any sense, she starts to turn into a Godzilla-esque monster, which is a rather a big problem when the pretty boy who you have an eye for is suddenly interested in you. And so this second volume is very much around kind of, Arata, the pretty boy in question, kind of asking Kuroe out on a date to a theme park. And it's actually, it made me sad, good way, but in a good way, but it made me sad because this volume is really intensely about kind of Kuroe's anxiety and self-hatred. Like, it is very pinpoint, laser focused on her kind of worries through, like, the build up to this date, and every part of this date is like, oh no, like, what's he gonna think of me? Like, what if this gets out of hand? What if he finds out this secret of mine? What if he doesn't like me? What if? And, like, it's really kind of intensely, like, in her head in a way that is actually really well written and kind of, like, really actually quite powerful. Like, but it's also, like, kind of stressful in a sense, because you really get into that character's headspace of just this constant kind of, and again, like, it's a really good piece of kind of allegory of kind of, you know, teenage existence where you're just constantly worried about what other people think of you. But it just does a really good job of communicating that and kind of getting you into that mind space of just, like, constantly being worried about every little thing being misconstrued or leading to some kind of disaster where, like, somebody you like or, you know, or you want to like you is not going to talk to you at all, to the point where you just end up pushing them away and they're like, oh, okay, well, I guess you don't like me then. And then, you know, it does all just go wrong for exactly the opposite reason to, you know, everything you were worried about. And so it's a good volume. Like, it still has good comedy moments. Like, it still has some really good kind of visual gags. It has some good kind of, you know, again, reaction faces, etc., etc. It opens incredibly strongly with a really good joke with, the other girl whose name I forget, who is just like the kind of kaiju maniac.
Yeah, the kaiju
like,
lover, yeah.
Yeah, who's basically just like, oh, hey, Kuroi, I'll show you how to dress for this day, and you can kind of imagine how that goes. And like, she is the great piece of comic relief in this volume. Like, as much as I was a little bit worried that she'd get old fast and get irritating, she's really well used in the second volume, because she just kind of crops up when, at the exact moments you really need some kind of comic relief just to kind of break up the constant anxiety. And, you know, she basically literally drops in out of the sky to be like, hey, you know, it's time for a jokey bit. So yeah, like, it's a really good volume, but just not for the reasons I was expecting. I kind of expected it to be sort of the same kind of balanced way that the first volume was, that it's, you know, there is this obvious kind of, like, you know, teenage social anxiety, everybody hates me allegory, but kind of dressed up with shoujo sparkles and comedy. And, like, it is still that, but it just goes pretty deep and intensely onto the kind of, you know, Kuroe's feelings of sort of isolation and kind of, you know, trying to be accepted and finding her place in the world, which is, it's incredibly well done, like, for something that's, you know, kind of a bit cliche and happens in a lot of stories. But it has a really good, unique angle on that. And yeah, like, I really enjoyed it, but it was one of those things where I kind of, I sort of finished it and just needed to take a few deep breaths of just like, oh man, I feel like I was just like a teenager again for that last half hour, and not in any of the good ways.
Is there ever a good way for being a teenager? I mean, come on.
Well, that is true.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that sounds great, because the first volume dabbled in that sort of space, and, you know, the sort of like a vomit-inducing anxiety and self-hatred is something I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, and it sounds nice that it actually manages to keep up with that, and while also keeping the comedic edge. Like, I feel like, you know, the kaiju maniac girl who, as you, initially seems like a bit too off the wall, sounds like she's deployed well in this volume, almost like the Chica, the pink-haired girl from Love is War.
Kaguya-sama.
Yeah, Kaguya-sama, where she is like more out and out Goonie, but is also very, very helpful with both setting up and reducing tension between the main cast.
Yeah, for sure.
That sounds great. Yeah, I've got it to read, as I say, and I'm really glad to hear it goes in hard, although maybe I will save it for a moment when I'm feeling a bit more braced than normal, because that sounds intense. Because I mean, I'm sure it maybe doesn't come to this level, but it almost sounds like, you know, my solo experience diary, like levels of like to the bone. So
yeah, I mean, it certainly, you know, having kind of read the first volume, I came to this as just like, yeah, I'm kind of in the mood for, you know, sort of some light, fluffy kind of shoujo comedy with just like a little bit of an edge, but it was a lot of edge, and like, you know, the comedy is well balanced and there's just enough of it, but the ratio was not what I was expecting, let's just say.
Yeah, that sounds wild. But good on it. Like I've seen more than a few people picking this series up on the Twitters and could not be happier, honestly, that it's it's like, oh, cool, this series is totally getting legs, and I'm really glad for it, because if nothing else, I mean, also, how does the art stay to the same standard? Because I really enjoyed the art in the first volume.
Yeah, I think it still looks really good. And again, like it does good work with kind of like the visual style of that kind of anxiety around, you know, kind of Kuroe literally kind of breaking out as you know, becoming part monster, etc. Like, and it knows when to have sort of fun with that stuff as well, and kind of like it knows that its premise is kind of stupid on a certain level, and kind of it leans into that when it needs to, but also plays it straight when it needs to. So yeah, all of that is really good. Like, I think if there's one kind of black mark against this volume, it introduces a new character who is basically Kuroe's uncle, who is okay, but sometimes plays a little too close to the kind of like creepy, kind of overly close uncle.
Ugh.
And like, there are times when it never kind of goes OTT, but there's always just that ever so slight sheen of just like, I kind of just wish this character wasn't in it, because like it feels like he's not really adding a whole. It looks like he's going to add more to it moving forward, but like in this volume it kind of feels like it was a sort of we need something else to kind of to complicate some of the relationships in this series. This guy will do, and it's like, it's fine, but it's kind of not the strongest moments of this volume.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, take them where you can get them, I suppose. Ugh. So that's Kaiju Girl Caramelise. So moving on to the main part of our show for this episode is, well, our picks. Do you mind if I go first, Andy?
Please do.
Cool. So my pick for this episode was a bit of a doozy. I picked a physical only series to try and get Andy back for picking a physical only thing, although that's going to change soon, so whoops. But I picked Volume 1 of Master Keaton, released by Viz. It is by Naoki Urasawa, at least he is the artist. It's also written by Hokusei Katsushika and Takashi Nagasaki. There is some ongoing and never actually finished sort of rigmarole and controversy about the names on the front, but honestly I'll leave that to you, to Wikipedia, because that can explain it more concisely than I can. But Naoki Urasawa is the artist, and he has his sort of trademark style. This was written around 1989 onwards, and some of the initial chapters especially play into the Cold War element of things quite a lot. It's released by Viz, and they're releasing it in quite a nice, beefy, like 360-ish page expanded size with some gold embossing on the cover, and a very nice like cover which shows like a globe of the world when you bring it up to the light. So things that digital can't do is have embossing, I suppose. And I'm just going to read off the front of the cover because it has a really good synopsis of what this is about, at least for the first chapter. So Taichi Hiragi Keaton, the son of a Japanese zoologist and an English noblewoman, is an insurance investigator, educated in archaeology, and a former member of the SAS. So, like, tick, 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 right there. When a life insurance policy worth £1 million, and bear in mind that's £1989, so a lot, it takes him, Master Keaton, to the Dededede islands of Greece. What will he discover amongst his scuffles with bloodthirsty thieves and assassins? And so basically that's the synopsis of the very first chapter, which is exactly that. He goes to the Dededede islands in Greece. He meets up with a widow. He finds out what's going on with this inheritance and what's threatening the inheritance, etc., etc. And it kind of finishes up in extremely quick order. So basically it is about this sort of titular Keaton, who is mixed mixed English-Japanese heritage. He teaches at a school in Japan. He is often contracted to Lloyd's of London for these high-profile insurance cases where they need someone who has a bit of smarts about them to fly out and see if the whole thing's kosher and if they should pay out the insurance. And he also gets involved in a few other scrapes. He and the extended family have quite an exhausting family life and sort of series of various different ashes, matches and dispatches, really, to use a rather silly term. And so Keaton, he looks like a massive dorko. He has a little flick of hair coming down from his pulled back haircut. He's like a Brad Shoemaker if he'd let himself go a bit and also had his hair dyed back. That's a real close reference for the real heads. And it's got a lot, it's got sort of the early elements of Urasawa's style, his attention to faces, especially noses. It's got his attention to the fact that even when people are talking, it might have their mouths closed in the panel because that shows more expression and it brings out more of the character. And so it goes along that. It starts off being extremely episodic and kind of like at times it feels extremely exhausting where you're watching like a 2-part crime drama crammed into one manga chapter, like 30 or so pages. And so especially for the first 4 chapters, I found extremely hard going because it just lays out so much stuff and there's no time for you to enjoy any of it, really. Like, you can't enjoy the backgrounds, you can't enjoy the character interactions, you can't enjoy the action when it happens because everything has to be so rapidly written, so closely tied together that people are constantly jawing and talking and expositing directly at each other and you, and then directly resolving things. So the first, like, all that synopsis about going to these islands and finding out what happens is, like I say, 30 pages. And it's only after a few chapters when I was frankly starting to get really worn out and not enjoying it that the series kind of realizes or finds the ability to spend more time on its cases. Like, there's a 3-part investigation later on where Keaton himself doesn't actually get involved until the 2nd chapter of the 3, which is really nice because you get all this cool backstory and setup and you get to enjoy it without Keaton basically bumbling his way into frame and very smartly figuring everything out and being really, down with it. Which is perhaps one of my biggest problems with this series is that, he is almost far too competent because he has all these different competencies and knowledge and clearly can get himself out of any scrape. He's like a MacGyver mixed with Indiana Jones in a way, like far too competent, but of course incompetent when the story needs him to be. And so that's what kind of makes it exhausting, is that like it only took towards the end that I finally started enjoying the series because it had time to develop itself and spread itself out. I don't know if you felt quite the same way, Andy. But
I actually enjoyed it from the get go.
Okay.
It was I will say, like, reading like the first chapter of this book in particular was a real trip for me because like I knew of the name Master Keaton, but I'd never really kind of dug into it, and not really deliberately, just by design of how I tend to read things. Like, I didn't read the front of the book synopsis. I didn't really look into it at all. It's just like, I'm just going to read this kind of sight unseen and see what pans out. And, I'm reading through, it's like, okay, this guy is a teacher, he's the insurance fraud investigator, etc., etc. Suddenly it's like, why is there this crazy close-up with, like, action lines around this random spoon?
Hell
like,
yeah.
What is going on here? This is weird. And then the next thing I know, Master Keaton is just, like, laying out a dude with a ladle. And suddenly it's like, oh, by the way, he's also, like, a SAS master instructor. I'm like, what is happening here? Like, this is nuts, but also great. And so, yeah, I really liked it. I mean, the weird thing about it, and I feel like it is very much, it would be interesting to hear, like, how kind of, I know, somebody younger than I reading it would take to it, because it feels very much of its time in a certain sense. And the feeling I got from it, that I think is kind of why I didn't sort of bounce off the early chapters so much, is it kind of reminded me of sort of like late 70s into the 80s kind of like UK TV dramas that had a very similar cadence of like, before the days of like, oh, we'll have like 4 1-hour episodes. It'd be like, hey, you've got a half-hour episode of this thing. You need to wrap up this pretty intricate like storyline that goes some crazy places in a very short order, and there's going to be a lot of kind of dialogue and exposition in the middle. And it kind of felt like watching kind of one of those sort of older TV dramas unfold. So there's a weird kind of slice of nostalgia almost for me on top of this, that it just had that kind of feeling to it of just like, it felt like it was being very deliberately kind of, I don't know, I don't even really want to call it rushed, but like I totally get what you mean about how like quick, how much it has to cram into so little time. But I don't know, it always felt like it did that kind of expertly to me. So I actually really enjoyed the fact that it was kind of brief but kind of quite deep at the same time. Like that kind of actually hung together pretty well for me throughout.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting to hear. I mean, like, I get what you mean about maybe it's just a different media diet I consumed, but my first, like, sort of crime drama-esque sort of watchings were like, you know, Taggart, A Touch of Frost and all that sort of thing, you know, where it's 2 1-hour episodes, so you get a bit of time with your family to jaw around the kettle and figure out what might be going on, or more often than not, shrug and say, God knows, I don't know. And that's what kind of irked me about the first chapters, is it was so fast, especially when it was just like, I would open up a 2-page spread, and I know that Urasawa has in interviews talked about how important the concept of the 2-page spread with the top left and the top right and the bottom left panels being key to the flow experience. It just felt so crushed. Like, there's so, like, I'd open up a 2-page spread and go, fuck, there's a lot of words here, which sounds really Philistine, like a big Philistine moment of me, but that's also why I kind of, like, it took a while for me to enjoy it, but then, like, the last 2 storylines are long and have time to breathe. And as I say, the last storyline in the book, Keaton doesn't show up the first chapter, which rules, because they bring him in when his expertise is needed. And even then, they kind of bring him in unwillingly because he kind of just wants to doss about.
I do. I was just going to say, I do always love stories where they suddenly kind of sideline or remove the main character and just, like, let the rest of the cast or whatever else is going on in the story breathe. Like, that so often seems to work really well, because, you know, it's great having a main character who's, you know, interesting or whatever. And obviously in this case, like, you know, it's a character that's been designed to drive every element of the series, from kind of like the smart insurance stuff through to the action stuff. And it's like, you know, it's clearly, you know, the titular character is up front and center, but yeah, it's so refreshing when he suddenly gets to step aside for a bit and you get to see other stuff kind of going on in this world, in this scenario, and helped by the fact that it then has other strong characters that you can kind of become very invested in pretty quickly instead.
Yeah, because, I mean, it plays to one of Urasawa's continual sort of, like, his strengths, but also something he falls into quite a lot, especially in the more recent series, is he's very good at setting up side characters, and also then setting them up, making you like them, and then paying them off so you're not sad to see them go, and you don't feel that you were just kind of rope-a-doped. So that really comes through. Like, there's, again, the last storyline has a character called Wolf, and he is a really fascinating character, and you learn what his deal is and how he ties into Keaton's life and all this, and it's really fascinating as a result. So I really enjoy that element of it. And like I say, when it gets a bit more time to breathe, it really, like, I feel like I came out of the gate here in this review guns blazing, but I really like it when it had time to breathe and kind of, like, allow itself to marinate a bit, which was what exhausted me about the initial sort of almost first half of the book, is I'm just getting annoyed at the series because it is just jamming so much stuff on the page and doesn't have time to, like, enjoy any of what it's set up and quite capably presented.
Yeah. I mean, that was certainly kind of like, for the first few pages, that felt kind of off-putting, and just once you see that kind of wall of text and kind of, you know, speech bubbles, you're like, oh man, this is going to be one of these that's going to be kind of, you know, all talk and no action. But I know, I feel like those early chapters do a good job of blending all that stuff together. And I think it's actually the thing that I liked about this book as a whole is kind of its variety and its versatility. Like, for me, it could do those shorter stories, and I equally enjoyed it when it had time to breathe and to elongate things. And I know it's just nice to see something that has such variety, from kind of, you know, I mean, the one thing I didn't like about it is kind of when it goes into all of the family stuff, which kind of seemed a little bit kind of dull to me. I was like, that worked okay for a little while, but then I was sort of glad that it was over, because it was just like, there were some interesting stories around that, but it felt like the actual kind of, you know, family drama, quote unquote, kind of like stomped all over some of the more interesting parts of that. So I wasn't so into that stuff, but like, I know that the variety of kind of the tales that it tells, again, I think it was kind of went back to that whole sort of, you know, TV series of a certain era where they kind of had the freedom to just like do weird and different things, and it wasn't quite as formulaic, and it felt really refreshing to see a series that didn't have that kind of very obvious formula. Because when I read the first chapter of this, I thought like, oh, okay, well, I know what the formula of this is now. Like, Master Keaton goes, investigates a thing, it turns into some weird kind of, I need to use my SAS skills, and he uses that to, you know, that and his wits to save the day. But actually, like, it's not always that simple. Like, there's quite a wide range of kind of abilities and kind of things that he needs to do and things that he needs to use on a sort of story by story basis. And I just really liked the fact that I felt like every time I started kind of what was clearly a new story arc, it's like, I really have no idea what I'm going to get out of this. Like, this could be anything.
Yeah, you get an entire chapter at one point, which is like him trying to prove a statue was a forgery. And it's a really fascinating thing because lots of other character drama happens that's almost incidental to this like statue, and it kind of plays out nicely. Like, it does kind of spread itself out quite nicely across the time it has to make an interesting like set of characters and like an actual microcosm of a story within itself, which is nice as a result. But yeah, it's pleasant. It in that way. It kind of does that. I did like the family element, but I will admit that it gets a bit much when you've got Keaton bumbling around saying, "Oh, I should really phone my ex-wife. Oh, by the way, my old man is a bit weird, and so's my grandma." And it's just like, whoa. There's way too many family dramas suddenly appearing here. Like, calm down a bit. Like, there's a lot here. So
yeah. I mean, to be fair, I did like the whole like, I really should be calling my wife kind of running gag through this volume, because it's just like, you know, he's just like, oh yeah, I should have done that before I went out and got trapped in the desert for weeks. But oh well. Yeah,
that really, it does work in the fact that he constantly finds it. He always catches himself and goes, shit. So that works pretty well. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It does definitely have some sort of, I feel like some of the framing of the panels, like it's all drawn nicely, but I feel like some of the panels are a bit too tightly drawn, where it's very close-uppy on characters' faces over and over. But I do like the series as a whole. Like, Naoki Urasawa, you can kind of see like why he was already like fated at this point earlier in his career, and how he's continued to kind of develop and grow from there.
Yeah, I certainly like, I mean, this is kind of the first Urasawa thing really that I've read, and it's certainly kind of between the art style and the general kind of narrative style and sensibilities of it was just like, yeah, okay, like I can totally see, you know, where the kind of the love of the artist has come from, and B, it does kind of make me wish more of it was available digitally, but, you know, maybe I'll have to suck it up and buy some of it physically at some point.
Yeah, it comes out, it's all available digitally. Sorry, God damn it. It's all available physically. Urasawa himself has been a well-known like digital holdout. As it's in this shiny big edition, it is 11 volumes, condensed from 18 volumes in Japanese. There's like a remaster version of it, which I think was like a reprise that kind of went down in flames due to previously mentioned authorship controversy. But you can get the whole thing, like from Viz. I'd recommend almost going to a Forbidden Planet does 3 for 2 if you have one near you, because that really helps cut down the cost. But it's also, as I say, the one thing that I appreciate, especially now I have moaned about there being a lot on the page and a lot of talking and all that, is the book is the nice big size. Like, it's one of those extra large size manga, and so it really helps show you the art, and it lets it like show off basically, which is really helpful for bringing it out on the page. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. But yeah, that's Master Keaton. Unless you have anything else to say about it, Andy?
No, I think that's everything.
No, that's Master Keaton. So, moving on to your pick for the episode, Andy. And this was previously a digital-only exclusive sort of title, but has only this week been announced that it's coming out to digital in December. So, what the fuck? But Andy, take it away.
Yeah, I feel like they've done it just to spite me, having like bought it, finally kind of caved and like, right, fine, I'll read it physically, and then like, psych, it's actually coming out digitally after all. But that's all good, because my pick is Volume 1 of Silver Spoon, which is a series that you can catch me kind of waxing lyrical about the anime any day of the week, you know, probably just like pass by me in the street, I'll probably be shouting something about how good it is. And I've been meaning to kind of check out the source material for ages, but as mentioned, like, the physicality of it since it finally got released has kind of put me off. So it is a series from the creator of Full Metal Alchemist, but it is very different from Fullmetal Alchemist because it is set in an agricultural college, as per Hiromu Arakawa's kind of history as somebody who's kind of started life as part of a family of dairy farmers who seemed kind of fated to join the farming lifestyle and attended such a college herself. It's as you might expect as a result of that, like it's very aware of kind of the realities of that kind of lifestyle. But rather smartly, rather than kind of tell it through the lens of a know-it-all, instead the main character in Silver Spoon is a Hatchken, who is a young man who, in that kind of typical sort of anime/manga style, doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. But he's basically joined this agricultural college kind of out in the sticks, effectively as an escape from his family. And he is very much a fish out of water on multiple levels as a result, because he knows nothing about farming, etc., etc. He's come from the city, so he has no kind of, even second-hand experience of this. And B, he has kind of joined a college where pretty much everybody else is either already kind of, a part of some kind of farming family, or has a very clear idea of what they want to do, whether it's becoming kind of a vet for farms or whatever it is. And so he kind of stumbles into this world as kind of well, it's an interesting thing actually, because he stumbles in as the one kid who has no clue what he wants to do with his life. And although he's kind of, on one level, he's a nice guy who's always willing to help anybody out and kind of put himself out for anybody, he also kind of comes to this college with a pretty hefty layer of arrogance, because he assumes everybody else is gonna be kind of like these dumb country kids. And as the kid who studied hard, in school up to this point, he fully expects that he's just gonna blow everybody away with his knowledge, and that he'll just brush up in his farming books, and he's just going to be kind of the king of the school in terms of, being top of all the tests, which of course goes out the window instantly, because they basically say oh yeah, by the way, all the books are useless because the cows in Hokkaido are twice the size, so you can throw all those calculations out the window. But yeah, so it's very much, this first volume is a lot of scene setting and kind of character setup in a sense. It spends a lot of time just kind of going around sort of the workings of this agricultural college, the daily life there, and, kind of getting up early in the morning, all the kind of the practical sides of living in this environment, and so on and so forth. And I think it does a really good and interesting job of setting all of that stuff up. I'd be interested. Have you watched the anime of this, Elliot?
Oh, totally.
Okay.
I think I initially started watching it because you wouldn't shut up about it. Back when we did an anime podcast, right. And I fell in love with it. I adored that series, both of them. The fact we haven't had a third series irks me still. And I was always hot to trot on buying this manga, but due to it being physical only, I always held fire because I was hoping for a digital release. And then when you picked this, I was almost glad of well, fine, fuck it, I'll do it because Andy said so. And so picked up the volume 1.
Yeah, because the reason that I asked that is kind of out of curiosity, and again, this is maybe somebody can write in if they've just kind of read this kind of sight unseen from the anime, because the feeling that I got from this volume, which may be kind of tainted by having watched the anime, which I believe kind of covers 9 volumes or so, it sounds like it covers a pretty hefty chunk of it, is that this series feels so effortless in terms of kind of how it introduces its sort of secondary cast of characters.
Oh, totally.
Because, all of the characters, obviously you've got Hatchken, who's, your protagonist. You've got Aki, who's kind of the girl who sort of Hatchken falls in with, who, becomes a love interest. No real big spoilers there. But there's a whole host of kind of other characters that Hatchken kind of, rooms with and hangs out with, who are kind of on the periphery. But they just kind of become characters that you know a lot about, or you know enough about to kind of be invested in them without really having any major focus kind of within the volume. They're just kind of there. They don't even have that particularly they have the usual hey, everybody in class introduce yourself, but you don't have massive exposition dumps about who these characters are. You just kind of find out about them just because they're there. There's just kind of little snippets of conversation conversation, you know, people chatting like between classes and things that just lets you learn about these characters in this really organic way. And then when they do have moments where they come to the fore, you're like, oh yeah, I know what this character's deal is. Like, I kind of, you know their motivations, what they want to do, etc., without ever having it kind of rammed down your throat. And there's something really nice and organic about the way this entire volume kind of plays out. Like, everything feels very natural. There's never any real kind of like forced kind of dumps of exposition that feel out of place, which is partly thanks to kind of Hatchkin being kind of the newbie to all of this, because when people have to explain stuff to him, it doesn't feel like a forced kind of, as you know, kind of thing. It's very much like, no, like Hatchkin literally doesn't know how this stuff works and somebody needs to tell him. And so kind of, you know, the educational setting actually works really well, both as a kind of an enjoyable, like, okay, like I've learned some interesting things that I maybe didn't know before, but also just in terms of like moving the story forward.
Yeah.
And I think that was what I kind of came away from this volume enjoying, is like, this is just, it's not really demanding, but not because there's nothing to it. It's just that it's so good at just conveying everything that it wants to, that it's kind of zero effort to read, because it just kind of pours. It almost feels like it's injected itself directly into your brain, because like, you've not really had to parse or decipher anything or think about it. It just kind of, it all just sits and hangs together in this really kind of natural and authentic way that's just like, yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the end of it.
It almost, like, this is going to sound real dumb, but it feels like the ultimate sort of final stage of like the perfect series of segues and just characters like sliding into view to do their role and then move on. But not in a mercenary or aggressive way. Like, it just feels, like you say, it feels perfectly pitched with what it's showing you. And it works in multiple directions. Like, it's almost like the 360-degree manga where Hatchikan himself has to learn, and he has to learn a lot fast, and he's a great character who, like, one of the fun things is it has him realize things as well, and he has he isn't just an idiot the whole time going, oh no, but he has his own particular smarts and interest in things. And like you say, like, he spends ages swatting up on a book about animal husbandry to be told that all the facts and figures were wrong, and maybe you shouldn't worry about them so much. But it also has him realizing things, and he will say things, and then other members of the cast will be like, I never thought about it that way, because I've lived my entire life around horses, pigs, cows, chickens, etc. And it just, and they too will go, that's interesting, you know, and they have their own particular angle on things. You have Tamako, the girl who is like egg-shaped, basically, and her brother, and they're like a weird, like, sibling dichotomy between organic farming and agribusiness, and they, like, that's played off as a comedy element, and it totally is, but it does help, like, and they both then say some interesting things that help flesh them out. Hachiken himself gets quickly marked as the guy who is too nice and won't say no to anyone, and so he gets stuck tutoring this guy who has, like, a chicken farm back home, who is garbage at math, and you learn a lot that way. And it kind of takes it from all angles, like his friends, like as he falls in Mikage, and her like childhood friend from the farm next door, and the teachers, and everyone kind of pours knowledge into Hachiken, as you would, because you're a school kid in this agricultural school in the middle of bloody nowhere in Hokkaido. And it all, as you say, it's all effortless, and everything is a delight to read, which, you know, it's all well and good having this well-placed vat of knowledge and experience the series can draw from, but it really knows how to balance the good and the bad, you know, the waking up at 4 a.m., you know, but also the, like, intense cooperation of the whole thing. Like, you know, Hachiken at one point tries to do a shoddy job on cleaning out a horse's stable, and he basically, like, he doesn't get shouted at, but he gets, like, kind of roundly ribbed for it until he eventually learns of his own accord that he shouldn't be a shitheel and he should probably muck out the horse's stable. Which, you know, that entire arc, the horse stable arc, but that whole thing feels like a really lovely continuous storyline and a learning point for the characters as a whole. And so it really brings the whole thing full circle. There's like an amazing 2-page spread, which was like the first time that Hachiken sits on a horse's back. And although this is going back in time a lot for me, when I was very, very young, I went like horse riding on a weekend. I don't know. My parents seemed to think it would keep me out of trouble. It kind of didn't. I broke my arm. But basically, like even though I was 5 at the time, I remember that vividly. It's like, oh crap, I'm the tallest person in the world. Holy shit. I'm on a horse's back, like, and then the horse kind of just like makes a noise and shakes its head. And, you know, you are an extension of another living being. And it really, like, it both says that and shows that and makes you feel that in the series. And that's kind of, I feel maybe I'm going a bit too far, Andy, but it has an amazing way of like making a direct connection with you and making you both feel things and enjoy them yourself, like empathy, sympathy, blah, blah, but also just, you know, you can see and enjoy the characters. Like there's a bit of a tense moment where 2 of the characters basically fall out and then they both kind of come to terms with it and say, I'm sorry, I was a prick. You've got it tough too. Oh, well, that's okay. I know you've got it tough too. And it very lightly touches on the trauma that made Hachiken want to basically drop it all and run away, like to an agricultural college in the middle of nowhere when he knows bugger all about farming. And it just ever so lightly touches on that, but then it knows to leave it alone. And having watched the anime, that more of that comes to the fore, and it gives you just enough to be interested but not thirsty for that and annoyed that you weren't told. So it, you know, the whole thing is such an effortless blanket of like storytelling as a result. Sorry, I've kind of gushed a wee bit.
No, I'm totally with you. And yeah, I think it's kind of that sort of restraint in its storytelling that actually is kind of, I think it's part of what makes it so easy to just kind of like take it all in and relate to it all, because I mean, I think there's kind of two angles to this as examples. One is what you just kind of cited with that whole kind of argument that blows over relatively quickly, and like pretty much any other series would have turned that into an entire volume of manga of like, oh, these 2 characters, they had an argument and are falling out and they disagree on this fundamental thing, and you know, there's going to be this long road to the 2 kind of reconciling or kind of finding a middle ground or whatever. And it would be this huge thing. Whereas I think anybody who's ever had like an argument with a friend knows that the way it works in Silver Spoon is the way it tends to work in real life. Like, you have this blow up of like, what you, like, you know, you have this moment of just like, you're an idiot. Like, why are you taking kind of this course of action? Why are you thinking about things this way? Like, what's wrong with you? They come back with like, no, like, what's wrong with you, etc., etc. And then something else happens, and then both parties forget about it, and then kind of later down the line it's like, oh yeah, by the way, sorry, I was a real jerk about that, wasn't I? I was like, no, like I was out of line as well, and then you just kind of get over it and you make up, and like that's how the world tends to work. And like I think it's things like that like you say, it does what it needs to in terms of, you know, touching on these characters and their different experiences and the kind of things that are problems to them in their own lives, but it also like doesn't make it into this massive drama that kind of, you know, reaches out into every part of their lives for like X amount of time. And I think that is really powerful. And I think just like Hachiken's character in general is, again, I can imagine, and I mean, we've talked about plenty of series on this podcast and in previous places where you kind of, you know, all the kind of character archetypes that you tend to see in this kind of series, where it's either kind of like, oh, it's the super smart kid who kind of gets taken down a peg or two, or it's the kid who's a jerk to everybody, who, you know, learns the power of friendship, or it's the quiet, shy kid who doesn't want to talk to anybody, who comes out of his shell. And like, Hachiken is refreshing because he's none of those things, and he's in a different kind of way. He's also all of those things. Like, he has a broad personality to him. Like you say, like he's a diligent kind of hard worker, but he's also perfectly willing to like slack off if the opportunity presents itself. Like, you know, he's willing to help everybody and anybody, but he also has kind of a bit of a superiority complex beneath all of that. And it's so easy to relate to that, because most people aren't this very kind of defined and fixed character archetype of the hard worker or the shy person or whatever. Like, people have a breadth and a variety to them, especially once you're kind of at like Hatchkin's age and you're kind of like, you know, late teens. Like, you've had some life experience and, you know, you have facets too. Maybe you are the hard worker, but you still have days where you're just like, I just really don't want to do this. I'm just going to kind of do it as quickly and easily as possible and hope nobody notices I've swept it under the rug. And like, those are all things that, again, it's so easy to kind of look at Hatchkin's character and the extended cast and be like, yeah, these are characters that absolutely could well exist at this very moment and are perhaps like similar to people that I know. And that just makes it so easy to ease yourself into this series because they all feel like people who could actually just like exist in this very moment.
Totally. It also helps that, you know, it's a school, and as mentioned before, a lot of the characters present have their various dreams and aspirations and sort of viewpoints, and it's not, those aren't just bullet points or character traits. You know, they are active, moving, actors. They are evolving. They are continuously like changing and thinking about things. Like, you know, the guy who wants to be a vet, like, he has, like, it's not like he has a storyline attached to him. He has an ongoing concern about whether he will be someone who can, like, if need be, put an animal down if it is in pain, and he worries about that. And this isn't like a thing to be resolved or something where the Scooby-Doo crew get together and like have an episode about it. No, it's just a thing that he worries about and talks to Hatchikin about when they're both walking to class, and that's naturally how these things occur. Like, you don't, you know, although, you know, it'd be kind of probably helpful in some cases, but you don't just suddenly take a break and have a chapter or a week solving one thing at a time. It is a case of, oh, life goes on, got to wake up at 5 tomorrow. Christ, I'm hungry. You know, just life continues and rolls on. And that's kind of what makes this series for me really shine, is that, some of the people have very clear goals and they know that they only have so long to, achieve them, or, a window of opportunity. And that's what makes it really fascinating, is you have these characters who are both driven, like both in comedic and very personal aims, and people who don't know quite as much what they're doing. And that, it all kind of plays in together and makes the characters so much more refreshing and enjoyable. And frankly, just a lot more fun to watch, even when it has especially when you have the Goonie page of like two of them fight, like having a ping pong tournament out of nowhere because hell, we've had a bath and we're bored. So yeah. And I think the other nice thing with that is that although, it doesn't have like magic resolutions to, what kind of worries these characters, it does still kind of keep those things on the back burner and find opportunities for those characters and kind of Hatchkin from his own kind of experiences and knowledge to grow with that. Like, I mean, the whole thing with the character who wants to be a vet is a good example of that, because Hatchkin's kind of default response is just like, no, you'll be fine. If you want to be a vet, you'll be a vet. You'll be great. It'll be wonderful. And kind of, it's not really dismissive, but it's just like, yeah, don't worry about all that stuff you've clearly been worrying about for a long time. And then that kind of gets revisited kind of later in this volume, where kind of Hatchikin kind of has to face some of the realities where, he learns about like, oh yeah, like, if these kind of racehorses lose a few races, they're probably going to get put down because they're not of any use to anybody anymore. And he kind of comes back around on that to that same character and be like, I kind of get it now. Like, I see why you have the worries that you have. And the knowledge that I have now doesn't give me any magic answer to like make that any easy. I can't give you a magic piece of advice, but like now I get it. Like I've come to kind of understand like what you're struggling with. And like, yeah, I would have exactly the same problem. And it's that sort of understanding of other people that's really kind of enjoyable to see as sort of characters develop and kind of, bounce off of each other and are shaped by one another's experiences. And again, that all feels like a very natural part of like the environment and the way these characters interact. Yeah, it has and more than anything, I feel like it has a real, like, almost like a pan-humanity to it. Like, it is so, like, accepting of everything that is around it. Like, questions of life and death, questions of, like, having a family survive on a farm and, making ends meet, and the various different things that can make that worse. And there's a really good panel at one point where, like, they're after a horse race, they're visiting the horse that basically came third, and one of them says, "Oh, thank goodness they came to a decent like place, because now they can live a bit longer." And like the horse like starts to make noises and shake its head around, Hatchikin gets spooked because he's only really seen horses twice before. Someone comes along and says, don't worry about it. She just wants me to brush her. And then two of the characters are like, oh, wow, you're so good. You can understand everything about horses. And then he and the horse, of course, in the side of the panel start laughing and say, idiot, like, I don't understand people. How can I understand horses? And it's a really good, like, moment, mostly because the horse is there too. But it is a good moment of like, hey, everyone's doing their best, all right? Like, there's no one's magic here. There's no fucking, like, babble fish for horses. I just have figured out that the horse wants a brush.
Yeah, for sure. Which brings me to another very important point about this volume. Good horses.
Very good horses.
Can't usually say that about the manga we cover in this podcast, but yeah, perhaps best horses of 2019. So
at the very least, most muscular horses.
Yeah, most horse.
Most horse. Yeah, but yeah, it's a real joy to read. I kind of devoured it mercilessly in a single sitting because I planned to read a few pages and then just off it went.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the good news, bad news of it being available digitally, because I kind of thought, like, well, at least because it's all physical, like, I'm probably going to be able to read this, say, yeah, this was good, and then just kind of, like, forget about it and hope for a third season of the anime. But once it starts coming out digitally, it's like, I'm probably going to have to pick all this up, aren't I? Because, I mean, it sounds like the anime covers, like, the first 9 volumes or so, so there's part of me that's tempted, like, I could just get the latest volumes, but I kind of want to just read through and enjoy this whole thing.
Yeah, I feel like both the anime and the manga, like, they cover the same events broadly, but I feel they both work. Like, they both take the material and do very good things with it. So I'm glad to see.
For sure. And it's characters that I'm kind of willing to just, like, revisit multiple times. Like, even though I rewatched the anime recently, because plug, my employer released it on Blu-ray. And so, I rewatched it all for that purpose, which almost had me worried about this, of being like, is this just going to feel stale reading it, kind of experiencing that again, but in manga form? But it really didn't, because it's just like, I love the characters so much. I find the setting really kind of fascinating, and it all just sits together and really, really works for me. And I think it also kind of, like, made me appreciate Full Metal Alchemist a bit more, because, like, talking about the secondary character stuff, I kind of realized, like, Full Metal Alchemist also a really strong series in terms of, like, making secondary characters, like, really pop and really interesting without kind of throwing them at you. And it's like, yeah, actually, it made me appreciate kind of, I think, Arakawa's kind of broader oeuvre of work as well as a result of this, because it's far more kind of easy to see when it's this sort of relatively simple story at its core.
Oh yeah, totally. Like, Full Metal Alchemist, like, it's been a while since I revisited it, but most of the characters that come initially to mind are not the Elric brothers for me. They're all the secondary characters, like their teacher and her husband and Greed and Lust and all the other characters and all the other nutso characters, the members of the Führer, the police apparatus, various characters that appear for one episode and make an indelible mark in you. Tons and tons of great characters in that. Because they're just a marvel to see. One thing to note about Silver Spoon, jumping back to this series, is there are 11 volumes currently released in English. There are 14 in Japan currently, but it has been mentioned that it will be ending soon, probably in a few chapters or so. So that'll probably wrap up, have the last volumes released, and then it'll just be the wait to see them come out over here. And as mentioned, it is coming out in December digitally, and they're going to basically plonk all the first 11 volumes on there day one. So that's nice. Except maybe not so nice for your wallet. Also, unsurprisingly, this is one day after my payday. So I'll have to chop my arm off, frankly, so I don't just insta buy the whole thing.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be writing a letter to Santa saying, like, hey, can you buy me stuff on Comixology?
Yeah, dear Santa, I would like a horse.
Yeah, that's just every year, but that's all.
I want a pony. Oh God, or a piglet called Pork Bowl. So there you go. God, I completely forgot about that and how early that storyline starts, man.
Yeah.
Fucking Pork Bowl. Right, so, that's Silver Spoon. Wow, we've gone long. We really got stuck in this episode. So, moving on, what we're talking about next episode. So, Andy kind of picked my pick again. So, what have you picked this time, Andy?
So using my psychic powers, I realised what Elliot wanted and decided I know what I'll do. So my pick for this for the next episode is Komi Can't Communicate Volume 1, which is a series that I'd kind of like been interested in just from the premise for a while, but hadn't really seen anybody talking about it. But now, like, it seems to be a few volumes into its Western release, I've seen a bunch of people suddenly saying, "Oh, by the way, this is really good." So I was like, well, I guess I should see for myself. So that is my pick.
Yeah, I've always known a few boosters of this series, to the point where some people got upset by the translation of the title into Komi Can't Communicate. And so I gave in and read this a few weeks ago and was planning to bring this up a little later in this podcast, but now Andy's forced the issue. So I'm going to be revisiting this. So I've gone for another series which also has its boosters and kind of feels like it's ridden the wave of online popularity into being published, even though quite a lot of people looked at it and went, no way anyone will publish this. So I picked up the comedy series The Way of the House Husband, which is basically about a Yakuza thug and John Wick type who ends up getting married and becoming a house husband, and his really, really effing intense ways of doing household chores, basically. It's really adorable. I really enjoy this series. It's got a lot of heart, but wait for the episode to hear more about it, I suppose. Cool. So yeah, we'll be looking at taking a look at that. Okay, so moving into close down, we have our, as mentioned, now shiny new website at Screentone.club. If you do like this podcast, please consider telling a friend. This is how most podcasts grow, through word of mouth. Ratings and reviews are always well appreciated on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, one of the other 8 places we're on that we get 1 or 2 listens on. If you want, you can follow us on Twitter at Screentone Club. You can also send us an email to show@screentone.club if you so fancy. The only thing we've received so far is an email about penny gigs. So, plug
the important stuff.
Hey man, it brightened up a bad day. I'm thankful for it. And so moving on to personal plugs, my name's Elliot Page. You can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter, where for the next few weeks I'm going to be talking about politics. So I'm sorry, but also not sorry. It's too late to register to vote now, so you better have done it already. All right. And also Andy, where can people find you?
Yes, you can find me probably also talking at least partially about politics at Hannah's1979 on Twitter.
Grand. So, thank you very much for listening. Thinking about it, the next time we have a podcast release will actually be after the election. So thank Christ for that. So talk to you all on the other side. Thank you everyone and good night.
Bye everyone.